Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. At a time corruption is rampant and no arrests have been made, 3 years have lapsed after the Yahapalne government came into power. What is the role of the civil society? Our topic of discussion today revolves around, can the civil society ensure that the coalition government will in the remaining term deliver on its key election promises and commitments made to the civil society? To discuss all this and more, we've invited 4 guests to our studios this evening. Let me quickly introduce them to you. Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, Department of History, University of Colombo. Nice to have you on board, Dr. Devasiri. Also joining us this evening on the show tonight is Dr. Uturn Fernando, researcher on civil society and NGOs. Also joining us this evening on the show is the very vocal Krishmal Varanasuriya, lawyer, national convener Rata Suryakimu. Also joining us on the show is Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, senior lecturer, the Open University. Nice to have the 4 of you in our studios this evening. Let's start off tonight's show with Uturn Fernando, researcher on civil society and NGOs. Dr. Uturn Fernando, right now people are complaining about the state of affairs in Sri Lanka. Who should be held responsible? Is it the government, the civil society, or the people? Your time starts now.
Well, I think it's one approach of understanding things is to take responsibility, and the other way is to pin blame on somebody else. Mm-hmm. I think it's today's theme of our discussion compels us to take a combination of approaches, because there was an element of collaboration, understanding between the government that was voted into in 2015, the government and some sections of civil society. So I think we should understand the performance or the result of the government from that perspective. So it's a combination of responsibility and also critique. So I would say that we should also put things in perspective and understand the overall context in which civil society made a pact with the government that was voted into power in 2015, and then the state, the government functions. I think it's with its own kind of course, mm-hmm. and then the results, needs to be assessed, scrutinized with a combination of criticism and understanding of the context in which the understanding was reached. So I would take a combination of critique, and also I would also understand it's not to justify, but to understand and appreciate the conditions under which the government is working. It's not to defend what the government is doing, but to understand the bigger picture.
But the government, if I may say, the government has failed in its duties over the last 3 years. Would I be correct?
I think if you take a list of promises given by the government, I agree with you. It has not delivered certain things that they promised, and particularly the demands made by the civil society. As you know, there were 2 instances where civil society groups signed 2 MOUs, first in the run-up to the presidential election before January 2015, and in the run-up to the general election in August 2015. Interestingly, the demands or the conditions expected by a coalition of civil society, that demands were nothing to do with those organizations themselves. They were not the typical NGO types, but they were broad citizens coalitions or networks, and the demands were very broad-based. It's about reconciliation, it's about new constitution, so on and so forth. So these demands have not been met by the government, and they have not been delivered. So obviously there's a frustration.
You often hear U-turns being made by President Maithripala Sirisena himself on certain decisions that are executed or implemented. Why?
Well, I think I would understand the presidency. I see things, clearly we see 2 centers of political authority. especially in a context where we have a coalition government in a way that we are not used to in history. So you have a presidency which is headed by the President Sri Lanka, and his entry to office was also, I think, the conditions were quite unique and special. So we should also understand the entry to office was not the normal kind of course of action. And then you have the other center of political authority, which is prime ministers and the cabinet, which is very, very different. So there is a inherent contradiction or a conflict which emerges from time to time, and the sources are varied, because these two political parties are subscribing to very different kind of political ideologies. They have their own histories and trajectories, but for reasons of forming a government, a coalition government, and to oust a very strong regime which was present before 2015, they came together. So although there was some kind of a political expediency, there was an immediate task to do. The ideological convergence and understanding was minimal. So
Thank you very much. Yes.
there's bound to have contradictions and conflicts, and as you call it, U-turns.
Thank you very much, Uturn Fernando, research on civil society and NGOs. He also holds a doctorate. I now move my attention to Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, senior lecturer at the Open University. Dr. Amarasuriya, last time when you were on the show, you were disgruntled. You were dismayed with the performance of the government. We're now in a very critical juncture. We're just after yet another cabinet reshuffle. We're looking things afresh, at least now. Do you think that there is a glimmer of hope for Sri Lanka, at least now, just 18 more months for this government to show what they're capable of?
There's a glimmer of hope now than when I was last here.
Yes.
I don't think there is a glimmer of hope. I think the government will be on survival mode for the next 18 months, so I don't think we can expect any miracles. What they weren't able to perform in the last 3 years, I don't see how they can turn around and do things in the next 18 months, especially when they are going to be thinking about the next election.
I want to drag your attention to the statement made by President Maithripala Sirisena at a recent event. He says that his role as a politician is not over. What does this mean? Does it mean that he will contest the next elections?
I mean, I think he has certainly indicated that there is a very good chance that he would. I mean, he's phrased it very carefully. He hasn't said that he is going to contest as the presidential candidate. He said that he's going to be his political career is not over. That could mean many things. A person can continue to have a political career without holding a particular office, or so he's playing it very carefully. I mean, he's not committing himself one way or the other, and that seems to be the kind of mode he's in right now, to sort of say whatever is appropriate in that particular moment. And I don't think we have to sort of place a great reliance on what he says, because it could very well change. I mean, I think he's just hinting that the possibility is there. He's open to that. He's not committing himself one way or the other.
We see a candidate coming through from the joint opposition, at least now. We saw the recent event which was hosted under the patronage of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the former defense secretary, and now there is talk about will he be the next joint opposition candidate at the 2020 presidential elections. If this particular individual does come into play, as Minister Mangala Samaravira pointed out, it's going to be extremely dangerous. As a member of the civil society, how do you react to this statement that was made by Minister Samaravira, and also the entry of Gotabaya Rajapaksa to the political forefront?
Well, I am worried about the entry of Gotabaya Rajapaksa into the into the political arena.
And why is that?
But why is that? I think his performance as the Minister of, the Secretary Defence has given us plenty of reason to be worried about how he might function as the president if he ever gets elected. But having said that, I also think that this might be a good thing in that up to now, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has not had to do politics. He's presented himself as someone who's outside of politics, and he never had to really confront his political opponents. I mean, he was a bureaucrat or a military person. He was never sort of in the eye. He never had to be had to answer to any other his political opponents. If he comes into this as a political candidate, then he's going to have to actually deal with politics. He's going to have to deal with his political opponents. He's going to have to explain himself, defend himself, argue, and that, I think, will be a very different role for him. And I think that might be good for him.
What do the people of Sri Lanka
show him
want?
up in different ways.
What do the people of Sri Lanka want? Do they want a dictator? Do they want an individual who promotes democracy? What's the need of the hour right now?
I think there are different views on this. I'm sure.
What is your view, Dr.
My idea is, I think people want some kind of stability. People want things done. There's this sense that nothing is happening, and that things have to happen, and they want someone who can make things happen. Whether that's through a dictatorship or whether it's through democratic means, I don't think people are expressing too much concern about things. They just want things to happen.
Thank you very much.
And that's a bit of a dangerous situation, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, Senior Lecturer at the Open University. Aren't we all in a dangerous situation right now? I now move my attention to Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, Department of History, University of Colombo. Dr. Devasiri, you were an individual who supported the candidature of President Maithripala Sirisena prior to the 2015 presidential polls. Would you take a U-turn now, and if that U-turn is going to be towards an individual, who would that individual really be? I'm pretty sure it's not going to be someone who's dangerous, as Dr. Amarasuriya points out, but I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I don't know whether I'm supporting an individual, and so I'm expressing
Would you take
my
a U-turn?
views, and actually well, you might be referring to, some of the statements I have made, over the last, few months or so on social media, and, some other media as well. So I'm just, these days, the communication is a very interesting and, the competitive thing, and, you have to find many ways of communicating ideas, right? But so I'm trying to make a statement, and this of course, as you said, I also supported the Maithripala Sirisena's candidacy, and actually, rather than on my own terms, and it's as someone who tried to represent the broader views that emerged from the society, especially in the context of certain negative the development that took place in the last the previous regime. But when you look back, so there is a growing gap between the expectations that formed the reformist agenda of the Maithripala Sirisena's campaign and the actual performance of the government, right? So therefore, there is a kind of disillusionment, not only among the general public, right, and also among those who supported the president.
So you mean to say that you would take a U-turn?
Well, I wouldn't. I don't think that I would take a U-turn. I would continue to represent the agenda that I promoted January 2015. So, what is the agenda? If you ask what the agenda was, the agenda was very simple. You know, I participated in the Maitripala Sirisena campaign, and even before he was sort of chosen for as the candidate, I identify three or perhaps four broader themes. One is what we call as the good governance and reforms in the governance, and the second is broader reforms in democratic system, more democratization, and third is a kind of new sort of social contract between various ethno-religious communities. That was a major issue in the last few years, especially since the end of the war. And the last but not least, the social justice, which was a very important issue. So these issues were at the forefront of the Maitripala Sirisena campaign. But unfortunately, it's not unfortunate, but quite understandably, there were other, agendas, other interest among those who actually, came into power as a result of this political change. Right?
So you bring in 4 points. You say good governance, broader reforms, social contract, ethno-religious communities, and then social justice. Given the fact recently your social media updates and so on and so forth, Dr. Devasri, to be very precise, do you think Gotabaya Rajapaksa represents all these four?
I don't think so.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasri, Department of History, University of Colombo. I now move my attention to Krishmal Varanasuri, lawyer, national convener of Rata Selekam. Very quickly, before I start the timer, Krishma, I just want to know what happened to the People's Intellectual Assembly, because we've been introducing you as the Joint Secretary for some time, and now you come up with a new name. What's the thinking behind this? Very quickly before I start the timer and pose the question to you.
The people are still there, the Intellectual Assembly is still there, and we still continue an intellectual dialogue. I'm still its Joint Secretary. But your time has started.
No, don't worry. I'll give you some time on top of that.
But if you remember, the Intellectual Assembly was where even people like Nirmal, Kirti, so many of us activists got together on separate issues. And we found that we needed a forum where not just individuals but even organizations could join. So even the PIA, the People's Intellectual Assembly, is part of the Rata Selekam movement. So is the Kandi Purawasi Peramuna. We've just had 16 other district organizations joining us. And we registered ourselves as a legal entity because we want to work as a proper lobby group to bring in policy and reforms of policy in the country. And we found that we needed a vessel to do that, where not just individuals like us, but even organizations could join in, and we've done that.
Krishmal, getting back to the question now, do you think that civil society in Sri Lanka has failed in its duties as far as good governance is concerned? Because I know you're an individual who, again, just like Dr. Devasri, who was a staunch supporter of the Yapalne government at one point, and many times you've come to the show and you've said you're very disappointed with the way in which things are working out for the government, and as an individual who represents the citizenry, that you are very disappointed. So don't you think the role of the civil society has come into question right now?
Not necessarily the role of civil society, Shamir, but I agree with you. We've more than once, Nirmal and I, and all of us have expressed our concerns, disillusionment, if you like, with not having attained all the ideals that we may have set out to achieve by the change of a regime. But I want to take perhaps your viewer to our perception of civil society and what civil society actually ought to be. You see, now we look at civil society because so many of us in this country are not doing their jobs. So a few of us have to come like this to your shows in the night at 10:30, or go and organize public agitations or press conferences and shout for everything under the sun. because lots of institutions have failed. There is a vacuum, a lacuna in the institutions that are, whether it's corporate, whether it's media, whether it's in governance, the three traditional institutions of government, everywhere that people seem to run behind a politician, thinking that a politician is going to be the answer to every ailment that you have. And therefore, some of us have needed to come out and shout and say, no, that is not it. There is a policy-based approach to it. But I want to take your viewers to Shamir, what civil society actually ought to be. You see, this is a much longer discussion that I think your time will permit me, but very quickly, you see, in much more developed democracies, the concept of a republic, that citizens form a concomitant part of a republic, that they can't just sit back at home and watch the news at night at 9:30 and see whether the politicians have solved their problems. But people go out on, say, if it's a corporate sector, they make a lobby group within that corporate sector and they bring out issues, they do research, they get an alternative, then they go and meet and lobby the executive arm of government. Now this comes to the new abolition of the executive presidency. I don't know whether you're going to discuss that in time later, but very quickly say, in some democracies, the executive arm of government is totally devoid of parliament. It's outside of parliament. Unlike us, where this confusion state where we pick our executive from our legislature. The cabinet is picked from our legislative members who are gone through another vote. So, in countries such as that, where executive arm of government is allowed to function on its own, independently, such lobby groups, civil society activists can go with their policy, go with an alternative and say, look, we will help you, because then the executive arm knows, well, the people are with this particular lobby group, say it's a gun lobby or the anti-gun lobby in the US. Then that policy is then brought about from the executive through the legislature. Now that is what civil society ought to be doing. So I don't necessarily think that just because Shamir, 2015, we formed a social contract. All of us got together and we thought we'll give the power of governance over us to a regime of individuals. 2015 January, then that continued to 2015 August. That contract has obviously failed. In my opinion, that contract has been breached. The contract that I thought I took part of has been breached. But I don't see that as a negative. You see, because in 2015 or just before October, November, there were only a few of us who were voices in the wilderness almost. And I've said this before, no? On election night, we couldn't even stay at home because we were advised not to stay at home in case elections are failed. They say you're on a list, your name is on some list. But now, you see how many civil society or voices have sprung up now. How many people are now agitating for everything from a water tap down the road to the cultivation of farmland. So that has now availed itself to a larger voice of civil society who are now, I know it's not the ideal, like a very developed democratic system, but people are agitating. And there appears to be more voice of a floating vote than that there was in 2015. So coming near 2020, as I've heard some of these politicians themselves, the smarter ones, saying on air, on your news and all that, we now realize that the party vote is no longer the block that we used to have. A lot more have joined the floaters. So now civil society has a very active role, a positive role to play in getting policy through and getting the politicians behind the policy. Because if they don't attract, if the politicians don't support the policy, then we won't support you.
Thank you very much, Krishma Varasu, a lawyer, national convener of the Rata Suraki movement. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate left is attorney at law Sonali Vanagavaduge, and on to my far left is Nadim Majid. So let's start off the show with Sonali.
Thank you, Shamir. Dr. Harini, my first question is to you. With the January 2015 elections, we saw how civil society was a true catalyst in bringing about what we believed was change, along with Venerable Madhuluave Sopita and the March 10th movement. We saw the manner in which civil society was converging towards a common goal of taking forward the country. However, a couple of years later, we seem to see a lull of sorts. And on the other hand, we see policy instability. There's a sense of inertia, a sense of frustration among the masses. As an academic, how do you view this situation? Where exactly have we gone wrong?
I'm hesitant to describe it as something that has gone wrong. Rather, I think maybe our expectations of civil society are also in a way misplaced or false. right? I think civil society is very much a reflection of the society, the socio-economic, political context within which it functions and exists. And in 2015, there were a particular set of circumstances within which a group of people with very different ideas and very different ideologies, different groups, were able to come together for a particular movement, and it was in a particular moment at a particular moment in time. I think if we expected that kind of group to survive and to continue and continue as a pressure group in the same way, I think that we shouldn't expect. We shouldn't have expected, and I don't think we expected that either, because that group was a very unique group. It came together in a very unique situation, and don't forget, it also had the leadership of a person like Madhulave Sobita Hamdro, who had that kind of charisma and the sort of moral legitimacy to lead that particular group. But I think what we see, what you refer to as the inertia, is very much a reflection of the crisis of civil society in Sri Lanka. I mean, we talk about civil society in Sri Lanka as if it's this one sort of block body that sort of functions unanimously or in sort of in unity. It's not. There is no one civil society.
Right, so we're talking about a diverse group of individuals and groups.
Yeah.
So if they come together during a particular time towards a common cause, and now the cause is achieved, then what happens next?
Well, what happens next is what we have experienced, because I think those groups then also go back into their own little interests, their own little agendas, and then they function in different ways in order to get their own agendas going on. Nirmal talked about four pillars that he thought was important during that time. I don't think all those groups that came together at that moment subscribed to all four. There were groups that subscribed to some and groups who didn't subscribe to the others. So then they sort of start functioning on their own, and I think it's also very much a characteristic of Sri Lankan civil society, perhaps in other places also, that like our political system, we work on a system of networking and relationships and patronage. And I think we kind of, maybe civil society also saw that rather than taking on a sort of a backseat, they kind of got into government. They became very close to government in a way and tried to get things done through those associations and the relationships that they had established.
Right.
So I think that also then, you know, that sort of classic separation of civil society from the political state structure becomes very blurred in those kinds of situations.
Thank you. Dr. Uturn Fernando, would you agree that the role of civil society has been overstated? Are we expecting too much from civil society, or are we singling out civil society wrongly? What is your take on this?
I think I tend to agree with you that we give too much emphasis, importance to civil society, and as a researcher and also as an activist, I have an understanding about the strength and the strength of the civil society, at least some sections of it. So you can't expect a lot. It's not a professional kind of, full-time bunch of, activists. They have, as Harini said, they have their own interests, they have their own professional engagements, and so on and so forth. So they come together, coalesce when there's a urgency, and then when their demands are met, they go back to their own interest areas.
It's quite easy
right?
to oppose something.
Yeah, so that's a kind of, that's one dynamic of certain civil societies are very proactive and certain civil societies are reactive. I think my understanding of Sri Lankan civil society is that we are much more, we show characteristics of reactive. We oppose, we try to change something. So I think when we are not that experience in collaboration, what happens is that when you start collaboration without critique, we get co-opted with the government. We blindly follow the government. I think it's not just this government. I would also take the 1994 experience. We had a similar kind of, so I'm not surprised to see what's happening now. It's actually the same pattern. in 1994, a new government was formed, and the civil society role was much more bigger than what happened in 2015. And the civil society, particularly the NGOs, numerically and financially and ideologically, they were much more stronger than what we could see in 2014. But you know, the collaboration was short-lived. By 1999, with the Wayamba elections, there was a huge, everything collapsed, right? So we see the same kind of pattern now, when certain part of civil society, you know, work very closely with the government. They get government jobs, you know, positions, chairmanships, members of commissions, and so on and so forth, and would be very much part of the government. And I don't need to name. The list is long. And it
I want
happened
to
in
interrupt you for a second
1994.
here, if you don't mind, Dr. Fernando. I want to just drag my attention to Krishma Varnasuriya, who is a lawyer also, the national convener of the Ratasirikura movement. Let's talk about the recently concluded elections in Malaysia. We just got the numbers. It says Mahathir Mohamad brought back $50 billion of the corrupt money after 5 days of election, arrested 144 businessmen for corruption, arrested 50 judges for corruption, arrested 200 cops on corruption, introduced tax reduction as of June 2018, arrested 9 ministers, and ensured that the airspace and sea is shut down, and ensure that the corrupt are arrested. 3 years have lapsed. This government has failed to fulfill its promises to the people. And as a result of that, you see individuals coming to the forefront saying that they may be the next presidential candidate. Isn't it a pity where Sri Lanka has fallen into? Malaysia did it in just 5 days. And it's 3 years and a few months, and we failed to do anything in Sri Lanka substantially.
It's no surprise, no, Shamir. Mahathir is a performer. He has shown that he is a performer. And long before Sri Lanka is where Sri Lanka is today, I'm talking of just after the so-called independence in 1948, and just after that, the 50s and 60s. Malaysia, Singapore were way behind where Sri Lanka was in terms of our status in Asia. But then people like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and Mahathir in Malaysia, they shot ahead. Why? Because they were performers, and I believe they had a conviction to do what they set out to do. Now, for example, now we are bordering on this. I recently heard the discussion of whether we are looking for a sympathetic dictator. Is that what we are? In Sinhala, someone said no yesterday or day before. Sonduru Ajnadayake. So is that what we are asking for? Unfortunately, if our social contracts are failing, where the so-called democratization of society is failing, we may be even inadvertently inviting this so-called sympathetic dictator like Mahathir or Lee Kuan Yew to come in and take over, because people don't appear to have the vision that they had when they spoke to us. I frankly feel, I don't know whether Nirmal shares this with me, I don't know, but I feel that we were used in 2015. Yes, I am disillusioned. I never had a lot of hope that things will suddenly turn from grey to white. But at least we had some inkling of a hope that things would be democratized, that institutions would function, that the lacuna that existed then, all in the hands of one man and just one group and a family, would disperse itself. No, it hasn't. From where Walasmulla, wherever, we have come to the Royal College gang. The 5 royalists seem to be running the country. When there are about 100 jumbo cabinet who actually don't even know what they are doing in the cabinet. They don't seem to know. And this is common, no? I don't mince my words. Only 4 or 5 royalists, with the top royalist at the head of, as the Honourable Prime Minister, appears to be running, and His Excellency the President. Unfortunately, he has gone to Royal College in Polonnaru, I think. Not the Reed Avenue Royal College. That doesn't seem to work. The royal combination of Polonnaru and Reed Avenue are not working. So, we have an executive president in whom we have reposed our executive power by a separate election in 2015, where all of us risked life and limb. Shamir, I get emotional. We had 2 young kids whose futures our friends said, look, Krishmal, are you mad getting on these stages? You have 2 young kids to look after. But we did that because we wanted to change a dictatorial regime. Now, because we have failed on the promises that we have given, we are now ushering our people back to think, well, maybe we need another Mahathir, like you say, or a Lee Kuan Yew to come and put a firm hand, put the foot down, say, give a good couple of khanes, let's do this. Maybe that's what Sri Lanka.
Who is the alternative?
I do not know. Perhaps, as Machiavelli says, that prince will arise from the rubble. I can see lots of princes trying to arise. One of those princes possibly might
Dr.
arise.
Davis Sri, I want to, you're a professor of history, so I want to, it's not really historic, more of a philosophical question. In Plato's Republic, he quotes Socrates as talking about the failures of democracy, and he very articulately points out how democracy will fail.
Yeah.
And around the world now, we're seeing this rise of this populist wave that brought into power Donald Trump, that brought immense popularity for the National Front in France, and you're seeing these almost fascist groups that are rising all across the world, not just in Sri Lanka and in India and in Pakistan, but it's almost a very global trend. Is this what we're seeing now in Sri Lanka as well? Let's focus on Sri Lanka. Is democracy dying in Sri Lanka?
Well, I don't think so. It is not dying. But I think, amidst all these, the negative things, what I see is that, the democratic political consciousness of the people is very strong, right? And Chris Mal was talking about.
Davis Sri, if you're seeing a broad cross-section of the people asking for authoritarianism to give them stability,
Yeah.
are willing to sacrifice their democratic rights and freedoms for an economic benefit that they are not assured of, does that mean that they have a strong democratic conscience?
Message. I think that you have to grasp the message correctly. I don't think that the people are asking for an authoritarian type of regime. They think that we need a sort of strong leadership. That kind. Because the democratic consciousness of the people cannot be judged in terms of by referring to the political science textbooks, right? But the people are very articulated, and as you said that now actually, with all these negative developments, one thing that has happened after January 2015, that the politics has opened up, right? So now people are, you're talking about civil society, but I think when you are talking about civil society, civil society is not one entity, as Harini mentioned. For example, even before January 15, the 2015 January, and the civil society, these are sort of elusive, the notion, and
civil
you can come up
is a
with
very broad umbrella.
and also it is divided, and there are some groups which can very well be called civil society group supported Rajapaksas, right? For example, now if you look at this Vietmaga, right, type of
Is
thing.
also civil society.
Yes, of course, right? There is a kind of upsurge, political revival, right? Things are not happening in the way that we imagine, right? And so therefore, this demand for a sort of strong leadership also part of that political revival, right? So you have to look at it carefully.
Dr.
To
Fernando,
what
I see you
people
shaking your head.
Huh?
You disagree?
No, I want to kind of, Nirmal made a interesting comment on Vietmaga as an expression of, civil society. At some point, I would agree with that. But I think the point that I would like to bring in is that, for me, the interesting, part of Vietmaga is bigger than that. It is a reflection of or an admission of the failure of political parties. And this is not a strategy used by the particular individual to promote his presidential candidacy in 2020, but even JVP, other political parties are promoting their own civil society fronts. Now there was a time that we experienced kind of organic civil society movements, irrespective of the promotion or the patronage of political parties. They certainly had contacts, links with political parties. There were always exchanges. Civil societies is not a kind of a isolated thing, right? They are not innocent. They always have, links with political parties.
So you're saying the problem now is that civil society is
now
too
it's a kind of, the political parties have realized that their kind of strength to mobilize has its own limitations. So they bring a kind of a civil society front to attract a popular kind of support. So it can be Viatmaga, it can be Pivituru Hetak, it can be Minisunna Disa Minisu by JVP. So it's an interesting phenomenon. So for me, the interesting thing is the failure of political parties.
No, that's a general, I mean, so there is a general failure of, now for me, the political party system is over, right? So there are, of course, the parties, but, if you look at the party, I mean, for example, the few decades ago, especially in 70s and 60s, so there was this, the mentality of Kapuat Kola, Kapuat Nil kind of mentality, right? How do you call it in English? I mean, diehard,
green,
party loyalist. But now, I mean, that generation is literally dying, right? So now, and actually, so there were no such that kind of party, the voters with strong party loyalties, right? So therefore, so these constituencies, these new constituencies, can be mobilized by various groups, right? I mean, that's exactly what happened in 2015 January, and I mean that election, Mr. Maitripala Sirisena was won purely on the basis of, the strong of non-party actors. So this can be compared with 1956, where the non-party actors were, the Mahajana Eksath Peramuna was not an organized political party at that time. I mean, now we are back again to a situation that there is a new political culture evolving.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. But before I go into a short commercial break, Shamindra Ferdinando, who is one of our regular panelists, has posed a question. He wants to pose this question to Krishmal Varanasuriya. He says, can you explain the differences between NGOs and civil society, or is it the same?
No, it's not the same, Shamindra. Hi to you. Thanks for watching. No, NGOs are by their name itself, a non-governmental organization. All NGOs do not form part of civil society, but certain civil society groups may be of that NGO model, which does not rely on funding. But Shamindra, once again, I must say this NGO, or the tagline NGO in Sri Lanka, is a misnomer in itself. Because if you don't have funding from the government, you need to survive, no? You don't bring money from home and run an association. So if you're governmental, the taxpayer will fund you. And then if we want to form some association and do some work, who's going to fund? Our grandfather. We have to get funds from somewhere. So then they necessarily become a non-governmental entity. They are outside of the normal government. But that does not mean that we have some foreign interest, some Videshiya Balapam, and that we are in expectation some conspiracy to overthrow a regime. That is a misconception. So all NGOs, I would not categorize all NGOs as part of the civil society, the lobby groups that I speak of. Because there are NGOs set up for different reasons, such as, say, health reasons or diseases or family planning or whatever. But certainly some NGOs form part of civil society activism. I put it that.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your thoughts, and the lady, of course, for your thoughts. In the second round, we're now going for a short commercial break. Stay connected. Stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. I start off the third round with Dr. Harini Amarsurya, Senior Lecturer at the Open University. Dr. Amarsurya, I want to drag your attention to the Vietmaga event that was held a couple of weeks ago in Colombo. You have the Defense Secretary, the former Defense Secretary, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, speaking from the podium of a Singapore-based hotel chain, which was sold by his regime to the Singapore-based hotel chain, and stating about not selling state assets to the international community. It's important to be patriotic. It's important to ensure that we move forward and protect the state assets in Sri Lanka. Isn't it the same thing that we hear from these politicians over and over again? False promises, hypocrisy coming into play. What's happening?
Well, I think it's very interesting because if you listen to his speech, it could have been something that Ranil Wickremesinghe said. You know, I mean, it was like sort of, here was the Secretary of Defense who was sort of portrayed as someone who's, you know, not really interested in economics in his past, but giving a very, very sort of speech targeting sort of the business community, targeting the upper middle class. So I think in a way it's kind of like a effort to sort of show us a new version of Gotabaya is not just about, you know, military power. Here's a man who can also talk about economics. So I mean, I found it really interesting in its sort of like its efforts to kind of provide us with a rehabilitated version of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to sort of calm the fears that the Gotabaya who's going to come in 2020 is going to be like the Gotabaya we know. This is to say, no, he's different. There's many more parts to him. Right? So, in terms of I don't know whether you can just say that that's hypocrisy or whatever. I think it was very strategic. It was very strategic, and it was sort of saying that it was very much, I feel, targeted towards a particular audience, and he was successful in doing that. But I just wanted to pick up on something that both Nirmal and Uturn also alluded to in this sort of the Vietmagas and the other kind of civil society organizations that we see emerging. In some ways I also see it as a sort of a disillusionment with politicians, and you sort of people seem to think that if you put non-politicians in front, right, like academics, lawyers, other professionals, that somehow they will be doing a better job. So in a way I think that's why political parties are now forming these kinds of groups, because it is a reflection of the failure of the political party. So this is to say, look, these are not politicians, these are other people who are sort of speaking on our behalf, and they are sort of objective, they are independent, they are this, they are that, they are qualified, and therefore you don't trust the politician, trust these people, trust the intellectuals. I think, I mean, in some ways I think that's also quite dangerous.
When you listen to the statement that was made by former Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the speech was on the lines of the speech made by Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Communist Party's annual sessions in Beijing, March this year. Now, just a few weeks prior, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was given a training program at a Chinese university for a period of 1 month. So do you think the agenda or the objective is to get closer to the Chinese once again? Because we've seen this development right throughout the Rajapaksa era as well. Well,
what's the difference in terms of the relationship with China between the Rajapaksa regime and the current regime? I think it's the global politics demand that, especially for a country like Sri Lanka, I mean, we are heavily indebted to China, so I don't think any government that comes into power, any individual who seeks to get into political position here can afford to ignore China or sort of dismiss China and say we are going to steer an independent path. That's not going to happen. I mean, the reality is such that China will influence and dictate to a large extent how politics in this country, the political situation in this country. So, I mean, Gotab is not a fool. He's of course he's going to be maintain his relationship with China. He has to. Any politician will have to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harinaman Surya, Senior Lecturer at the Open University. I now move attention to Krishmal Surya, lawyer, National Convener, Ratasurukimu. One of the allegations or one of the complaints made by the citizens of Sri Lanka against civil society is the fact, Krishmal, that the civil society forgets about the past. I'm not in particular referring to your movement, but many civil society movements forget the past. It probably is the fact that what this government is doing, the corrupt activities that this government is doing, is overshadowing what happened in the past. However, it's important for us to delve on past activities as well, Krishma. In this context, how do you view the role of the civil society? Because they're not talking about what happened in the past, they're not talking about the white vans, they're not talking about the abductions that took place, they're not talking about the killings that took place, they're not talking about the self-imposed censorship that they imposed on the media at one point. However, they're talking about the corrupt activities that are taking place now. How fair is that?
Shamir, it's not that, I think in my response you'll find the answer to your question also. I don't think it's that civil society has forgotten. But civil society, I think, are now competing with a list of wrongs. And then possibly why they're talking of what happened recently is because perhaps on a scale, the billions of rupees that are said to have been absconded from the central bank as soon as his present regime came to power may be taking a chunk of the attention of civil society. But having said that, I want to go back to what all of us were trying to say, that civil society also is now put up as a front by political leadership, and because of that reason, Shamir, I think of the criticism that you just leveled, because some of this, unfortunately some of our colleagues also who fought on the roads with us and faced the police barrels and the tear gas canisters have suddenly, as Sudhan said, started working very closely with governments. We sometimes see them whitewashing everything that governments are doing on media. And that leads to this criticism, I think, by society that has civil society forgotten the past. So it's very, I suppose we walk a very thin rope to be able to keep on at your target and keep harping on it. But can I quickly, because your time is running out, go back to what the principle I was trying to raise about civil society activism. You now take this recent example of some 1 million rupees being paid to some minister that's being talked about. Why is that? Because our executive branch or our ministers who make policy are picked from the legislature. Now we hear this politician say, am I the only one? All these corporates come and fund us during an election. Why do they do that? Why do corporates give millions? All of us know. Why do corporates give millions to both sides or three sides to make sure that when they go into parliament, their interests will be looked after by these people? Why? Because we have an absence of policy-based civil society organizations or lobby group who will take on policies. Now, for example, if our executive branch, the ministers and the cabinet were outside of our legislature and they were the ones who were bringing policy, like for example the United States, where there is a clear distinction, where the policy is made outside, they are not picked up from the House of Representatives or the Senate, right? And policy is made outside, such lobby groups or civil society organizations could then fund for an actual purpose and then go and make policy, do research, and then go and get those policy makers who are outside of the parliament. That would then be passed on to the legislature to make law. You see, then the system of democratic form of government that we think will work much better. But now, because we think that everything can be done by the parliamentarian who is elected at an election, all corporates fund these people because they think they can get their things done when they go to parliament. So, for civil society and even public roles to function, Shamir, also, we have to really relook at our system of governance.
Thank you very much, Krishmal Varasuri, lawyer, National Convener, Ratasurukimu Movement. I now move my attention to Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, Department of History, University of Colombo. Dr. Devasiri, do you think that this government has been trapped in its own words when they say they are bringing good governance, they are ensuring that Sri Lanka would be corrupt-free? Why am I posing this question to you? We saw the former Chief of Defence Staff of President Mahinda Rajapaksa being accused of transporting money. This was stated by his driver. It is not yet proven. However, there is an allegation against him. And then you find President Maithripala Sirisena's Chief of Defence Staff counting $20 million in a star-class hotel in Colombo. What's happening? Have they got it all wrong? Your time starts now.
No, I don't think that they have got it wrong. I mean, you have to look at what happened, at the beginning. So what happened was that, of course, there were expectations among the people, and those who mediated between those who came to power and the people, and those who came to power, And so they, as I said earlier, so they had different set of agenda. So they have different different interests.
So right? I'm referring to I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
I was referring to the Chief of Staff and not the Chief of Defence Staff. So getting back to bolts and nuts, we see the same thing happening with Ravi Karunayaka and Arjun Aloysius and Kasun Palisena and the entire gang with regard to the bond scam as well.
No, well, I think for me there's no pointing finger at particular individuals, and so there were continuities, right? So for example, what we expected was the break, right? But that's not easy, right? So then what the regime was changed, but the new the order, the existing order was collapsed, but it was not easy to form. The new order did not formed as yet, right? And so therefore, so now those who grab political power, so they are running the country according to their own agenda, and so that we are we are leveling all these criticisms based on our the expectations, right? So that's what we have to look at. There is a gap. So I think that's why yes, the government is morally responsible, but if you look at the real politics, right? So if you try to understand what is really happening, you have to try out a kind of different political culture, and so that's there's no easy way out.
Thank you very much.
So it is not like the bringing a new group of people into power, and that's what it's all about. What we are trying to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nirmal Ranjit, Devasri, Department of History, University of Colombo. I now move my attention to Dr. Uturn Fernando, researcher on civil society and NGOs. Dr. Fernando, you speak about the JVP at one point. I want to drag your attention to the United National Party, the role of the UNP. We saw just after the 10th February election defeat, which was common to the SLFP as well as the UNP, where Sri Lanka Pojana Peramuna emerged victorious. There was talk about party reforms at the SLFP front as well as the UNP front. And then there was talk about a change in leadership within the United National Party. And then we saw a committee being established as done in the past, and the ultimate result was the leader of the UNP remaining in his position, and there were few changes. As Krishma correctly pointed out, the royalists were brought into the table, and there were around 5 or 6 royalists handling or governing the UNP as a whole. My question to you is, the civil society is not talking about party politics. They're only talking about the corruption activities that are taking place within the country at present. Why is that? Are they fearful of the Prime Minister?
I don't think that, I mean, some sections of civil society, as my fellow panelists said, there's no single kind of, homogeneous unitary civil society. So certain groups criticize certain political parties because, as I said, a term which came to my mind after I made that, a comment on fronts, civil society fronts, is that you also see the next stage of that fronts of civil society formed by political parties is a proxy war, if I may use a kind of a warfare, a term, because you have, you don't have the political parties to, fight with each other. You put your proxies who would, fight their own fights. So there are a number of civil society groups who are taking on the UNP.
Do you think that the civil society should act independent?
I think it's, in theory, yes. But in practical terms, civil society is not a isolated kind of a ivory tower, because their very own role and task compels them to interact, make negotiations. So it's you cannot have a kind of a exclusive, pristine kind of, independent position.
Dr. Fernando, what if I tell you that right after the August 17th parliamentary elections, Lakshman Kiriyala, who was the leader of the House, came to Parliament and said, yes, an individual helped us and henceforth we will appoint him as a chairman of a particular government entity. Now, this individual is highly vocal about corruption activities that are taking place within the government at present. I don't want to mention names, but you had the leader of the House himself saying that this particular individual did help them in the election campaign. How do you view the role of such activists?
No, I think as I said, it's not the first time in history. Certain support groups support political parties. It can be civil society, it can be NGOs, it can be the corporate sector, with the hope and the expectation of getting in, getting public offices. So it's I'm not saying that it's right, but I'm not surprised. These are the expectations. I have also seen certain successful business people who are not driven by money. They would look for a diplomatic position abroad, even in a tiny country like 100,000 people of a population. For them, that matters. Position, right? You can guess, the name of the person I'm talking about. So there are these kind of, they support, sometimes financially, sometimes ideologically, sometimes they bring the masses, and they expect something. So that's a deal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Fernando. When you say it's a deal, it sounds all wrong, but I leave
it's wrong. It's wrong, but that's the kind of it's the exchange, right? I don't think that we would ever have a kind of a independent.
And I thought we are away from the deals and all
kind
that.
Of protect their boundaries, and I don't think
Unfortunately, we're still trapped. We're still trapped in that word deals. Unfortunately, before I open the floor for questions from our journalists, we have a freelance columnist, that's Srinath Fernando, posing a question to Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri. The question is, when nationalists come to power, the first casualty would be the truth and seekers of truth, the intellectuals and intellectuals. What's their take on this? So that question is for you, Dr. Devasiri. The question is very simple. The question is, the first casualty would be the truth and the seekers of truth.
Well, I'm very much critical about the nationalist. I would identify myself as a non-nationalist, but actually, what can we do? I mean, so there is a kind of, as a part of this, the revival of politics, so there is a revival of nationalism as well, especially whether we like it or not. So our politics is highly, this ethnicized, ethno-nationalist ideologies were quite strong, and especially the breakup of the decline of the this government also facilitated the revival of the ethno-nationalist groups, right? So therefore, yes, especially the ethno-nationalism is the dangerous the political ideology. But I mean, there's no alternative. We have to continue, the engaging with these kind of, ideological developments.
So thank you very much, Dr. Devasri. I open the floor for questions. Let's start off with Sonali.
Thank you, Shamir. Mr. Krishmal Varnasurya, in Sri Lanka we oftentimes find that this concept of accountability or vagavima is quite scarce. So now the government promised legal reform, constitutional reform, and rather than depending on one particular stakeholder to hold accountable the government, if we are to take, for example, the Bar Association of Sri Lanka as one of the main stakeholders, do you not think that it has a major role to play in campaigning towards proper consultative legal reform, where it gets the government to stop and take notice? This hasn't really been happening. We've seen with quite a few pieces of legislation. How do we need to go about this to do it better?
Yeah, I take your point, Sonali, but I sometimes think that, as I go back to my earlier point, institutions in the country in general have failed. We have failed, the institutions have failed, therefore we have started running after individuals. Whether it's in government, in politics, or even in associations, we think so and so will do the job, rather than thinking if we strengthen the institution or policy-based institution, that will function. But having said that, now I will also convene, as you know, of the law subcommittee of the Bar Association at one time. I've been a convener of several subcommittees. It's not that the Bar Association doesn't try to do. As you know, the Bar Council, the governing body, we meet once a month, and our subcommittees meet, and every legislation, every item of legislation, almost all, we have gone, let's look at, we have gone through and given our proposals. As to whether it is heard is a different question. Now I remember, I think your Face the Nation, a couple of weeks ago I was watching, when there was a representative from the bar who was saying here that they had given a detailed proposal on why the preferential trade agreement with Singapore was not favorable to Sri Lankan professionals. And he said we gave a detailed report that had not even been considered. So you can't, Bar Association can only do so much, no. Also you must remember, for our elected representatives to understand a detailed report given by professionals, they must at least have semi-intelligence, no. You follow? When you are talking of a legislature that is elected out of fellows who slap each other on the face and bite each other's noses in the House of Parliament, right? You think they are going to get into a committee and discuss a policy-based report? So I once again point the finger at our people. A democracy gets the leaders they deserve. The people need to be selective in whom they elect. Unfortunately, we have this system where our policy or executive is, as I said several times now, picked up from our legislature. So if that is what we are going to have, and we are not going to amend the constitution to that extent, then people need to be selective in at least sending persons who to represent them who will understand policy. Right? Who will understand policy. I am not talking rocket scientist. Every legislator doesn't not need to be Albert Einstein. But I am talking at least average intelligence to understand what is placed before them. Then associations, like you say, must also keep on agitating. This is, as I say, a republic is built only as hard as we try. We have to keep on trying, and we have to keep on doing the change that we want to see.
Right, thank you very much. Dr. Devasri, our focus of today's discussion is mainly civil society and its role in ensuring good governance. But civil society is only one aspect of a multi-stakeholder, multi-pronged approach in ensuring the rule of law and democracy. Do you agree with the view that Sri Lankans, the majority of the Sri Lankan masses, have a herd mentality? Do you think that this is a vicious cycle where we maybe go through a change and then, sort of stagnate in that change and then go back to whatever it was that we ran away from? Is it a vicious cycle? I mean, as an academic, what is your thought on that?
Well, you know, you have to be very careful when you sort of stereotyping, you know, this the popular behavior. But I think, you know, that you have this the herd mentality. You know, the opinions are not necessarily individual. You know, so there are collective, you know, opinions. So that they are mobilized collectively, organized collectively, express themselves collectively, and it is a very complex process, and so they are divided, and so there are a lot of, you know, economically divided. You know, there are, you know, number of, you know, different cultural you know, the divisions, right? So I mean, it's a kind of if you look at the look at our society, so there are a lot of extremely, you know, diverse society, right? So the political structure, you know, I mean, represent these the diversities, right? So I mean, so that is, you know, one important aspect.
Sure.
Right. So it is not you know, I mean, it's not easy to represent this
Yes.
diverse, you know,
Dr. Devasri, what I'm trying to get at is, I mean, it's quite obvious that we've hit a rut. So how do we break free from it?
Well, you know, that is yeah, but if you look at the evolution, I mean, so there are a lot of, you know, I mean, rather than looking at the negative side, I mean, I tend to look at the positive side, right? So there is a kind of, you know, the developed political consciousness, right? So they are, you know, represented, so they are mobilized, may not be in the way that, you know, we like, right? Even look at the, you know, so as I said earlier, so I'm critical about, you know, this the revival of ethno-nationalism.
Sure.
But, you know, even then, so there are a lot of criticisms about, you know, when the certain nationalist voices, they criticize the so-called Yahapalana government.
Right.
You know, there is a kind of inherent criticism about the violation of the you know, the ideas that they themselves propagated, right? So it's a, I mean, the democratic consciousness is a very complicated one, right? So therefore, you know, I mean, our task would be, rather than, you know, the labeling, you know, various ideologies, you know, continue to engage with them and try to transform them.
Dr. Amar Surya, I want to drag my attention to you now. Let's talk about the constitution that is being, the new constitution that is being discussed about by the civil society. We just saw the tabling or a private member's bill being requested by the JVP for the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which also seeks to prune the powers of the executive president and put the bulk of the weight on the Prime Minister. What is your take on the new Constitution, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution? What is your take? Is it necessary for us to move into a new Constitution at this point of time?
I don't think. Are you talking about the 20th Amendment,
20th Amendment,
or the new
is it a new
Constitution?
Constitution? Do we need either of them right now at this present moment?
Well, I think the JVP putting forward the 20th Amendment is entirely consistent with what they've been standing for the past several decades. I mean, they've been very consistently against the executive presidency, and I think that was one of the major expectations of the constitutional reform, that the executive presidency will be abolished, or at least reformed to a great extent. So it's the putting forward of the 20th Amendment by the JVP is very consistent with what they've been fighting for, I think, ever since the executive presidency came into being. Do we need a new constitution? Yes. Will the constitution fix everything? No. Will we get a new constitution in the next 18 months? Unlikely. But certainly I think the discussion about constitutional reform is extremely necessary and one that we should have. And I think given the disappearing sort of hope of a new constitution, even incremental change is good. So if we can do something with the 20th Amendment, why not?
Do the people of Sri Lanka want a new constitution, or is it a request made by the international community, or let me say a demand made by the international community to move into a new constitution for the country?
Well, see, once again, I think these are very sort of, do the people want, people when they elected this government in 2015 were very, very aware that a new constitution was in the cards, and it voted for that government, right? It voted for a government that was promising constitutional reform. So in that sense, yes, people in this country did want constitutional reform. But I think what's important is the people don't remain in one position.
Dr. Amritsari, you mentioned the need for, in the absence of having something like a new constitution, there should be incremental changes. You mentioned that the people of this country voted for a government that promised constitutional reform. They also voted for a government that promised a code of conduct for public representatives, a government that promised public access to assets and liabilities declarations of elected members, that promised to reform election campaign finance regulations. So these are all incremental changes that could have led to then maybe a new constitution. But in the absence of any kind of will to improve or to strengthen their own accountability, the public representatives, the MPs, the President, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Ministers, do you see any kind of incremental change being a possibility in the short term, under either this government or the government that follows?
See, I am of the view that having these initiatives, that in itself is a good thing. I think the debates and the discussions, the public awareness that takes place, the discussions that take place around these initiatives are of themselves useful. Whether we will actually...
But is it a good thing though? Because it seems that the more it is discussed and the less that any action is taken on it, the more it leads to public frustration and anger.
Yeah, and then they will act accordingly, right? So if the public continue to be frustrated and angry and upset, it will show at the elections.
But right? It will show by bringing in authoritarianism.
Well, then we will have to deal with that, right? Then we will have to face that, and we have to respond to that, and we have to deal with it. Democracy is messy. Right?
So
democracy is not a sort of a smooth path to from one nice thing to another.
We have a question to Krishma Varasu, a lawyer, national convener of the Rata movement. So you too can be a part of the conversation. Just log on to www.facebook.com/FaceTheNation and you can be a part of this conversation. You can pose your questions. I have a question for Krishmal. The question is, please ask Krishmal as to whether professional associations uphold codes of ethics and conduct against bad governance by members. Now, I recollect a few months ago when Chandra Jayaratna, who was the former chairman of the Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce, on this very show said that accounting bodies should take responsibility as far as good governance practices are concerned. So the question is very simple, whether professional associations uphold codes of ethics and conduct against bad governance.
Yeah. I can't assume to speak for other professional bodies because I am only a member of one and a member of some associations in the UK, but legal, all legal. Yes, the Bar Association takes very strictly to any breach of our code of conduct, which was my criticism against two recent outbursts by two members of our fraternity who preferred to go to the media and have a public conference and talk of the problems which ought to have been first brought to the Bar Association, because we have a discipline committee, we have a very strong ethical background. even a complaint directly sent to the Chief Justice immediately launches an inquiry into what code, what ethic you have breached. So I stand firmly with the Bar Association. I myself have represented colleagues who have some kind of frivolous things. Just a client writing a letter have been hauled up before inquiries saying, why did you do this, why did you not do it? So for the Bar Association, I feel that lawyers, I'm not saying there aren't complaints against lawyers, I'm not saying that. But as far as the Bar Association I know, and the Supreme Court that I work in, have a very strict code of conduct, and we abide by it very, very strictly.
What about accounting bodies?
I am unaware of, maybe my colleagues will know, I'm unaware of any accounting bodies.
Yes.
Dr. Harini, earlier on in the conversation you said that there's a disillusionment with politicians. On the other hand, we find that the qualified people, we find them saying that they don't want to get into politics in Sri Lanka because it's a dirty game. So it's a paradox of sort. And then over in the West, we have this sort of pull towards anti-establishmentarian sentiment with the likes of Donald J. Trump and Francis Macron. So my question to you is, how do we sort of reconcile between these opposing moves?
Well, I don't think you can reconcile between those opposing moves. I mean, that is how things are, I think, currently, globally also. In many ways, we see a sort of democracies in crisis, right? Sure. And the democracies in crisis are also, I think, partly a result of certain economic policies that have been in force for so long, that it have made people feel very vulnerable, disenfranchised, and so they seek their answers in alternative ways. And right now you're sort of looking for someone that is outside politics to come and save you from the crisis that many people are facing in their lives.
Yeah, but that person doesn't want to get into politics, so it's a bit of a...
No, we do. We have people who claim to be apolitical, who are presenting themselves as outside of the conventional political sort of system.
But at the end of the day, Doctor,
I'm not proposing that, by the way. I don't think that's a very good idea. But yeah.
At the end of the day, Dr. Uturn Fernando, it is the legislators that make the laws. So we find that the concept of theory and reality are sometimes too far apart. And in Sri Lanka right now, we're talking about things like policy instability, policy reversal, economic short-sightedness, short-sighted development. My final question to you is, as an academic and as someone who has studied the Sri Lankan economic system really for decades, does it not anger you that the people of Sri Lanka have to go through this kind of situation over and over and over again without us learning from our mistakes?
No, there's the anger and the frustration is shared by many of us, but we are also part of the problem. So I would always look at problems, as a kind of a collective thing. It's the political systems, the political parties, our choices. We are part of these interactions. So in that sense, pinning the blame on a single kind of politician or a party is not going to solve. I think what we need to do is to collectively raise the bar. I think we heard some positive kind of stories from Nirmal, saying that with all these kind of negative things, we are experiencing certain positive democratic conditions. Krishmal, you also alluded to that. So I think what, as far as economics is concerned, I think we are paying less attention. Our political discourse is very much focused on hardcore politics, the devolution, constitution making and so on. But our popular even civil society discussions are not targeting at economic policies. I think your initiative is the right direction in that sense. So I think I would take that responsibility as part of civil society or as academics. We should also bring that kind of bring that agenda item as a prominent one. And attach much more emphasis and importance than we have done before. So it's also putting the pressure on political parties to have some degree of convergence in their thinking on critical aspects of the economy. What happens is that one party would come and implement a particular policy, and when another party comes, they would change everything and implement something entirely different, right? And if a third one comes, we come to square one. I think what I would think is like now we have put certain pressures on all political parties to stick to certain levels of democratic practice. Let's say even 2020. I'm pretty sure that irrespective of the person who is going to be elected as the president, the collective pressure on democratic practice had made a certain impact on the performance, right? I think it's a positive thing.
Dr. Fernando, we see many civil society organizations. As all of you have sort of mentioned and agreed, civil society is also a very diverse group of people ranging from probably Viatmaga and other groups on one side to the other so-called pro-democracy, pro-rights groups, etc. on the other side, and a whole host of others in between, and maybe even Mr. Varnasuria's Rata Surakimu organization somewhere on that spectrum, probably towards a more accountable governance and transparency side, I'm guessing. Now we see that there are organizations that are pushing for reforms in governance, for greater democratic, for more democratization of the governance system, for things like improved access to the delivery of, or improved delivery of public services. Now this is happening to a certain extent. How do you see this role evolving over the next 18 months and beyond?
I think it's an interesting development, but I also have my reservations and doubts about the potential, unless we make a kind of a special effort to put this as a important agenda item, because our general tendency is to focus on hardcore politics. I think our plate is full as far as democratic reforms are concerned. There are a lot of things in the agenda which needs to be addressed. Compared to the level of policy convergence that we need to have reach on economic aspects, because we just leave it to the political party who would be in power to decide on that. So the popular discourse.
Dr. Fernando, is it right to sort of divorce those political reforms from economic policy reforms? So, for example, if you take your performance in several sort of global indicators of sort of ease of doing business, the business environment, these policy consistency also comes from a certain degree of political reforms and transparency and better governance systems, doesn't it?
Yeah, one would say that you can't divorce, but if you take the economic policy from 1977, right, till 1994, we take that as a kind of a milestone, and then again 2002 and 2015, you'll hardly see a significant change as far as economic policy is concerned. And the so-called market economy has been promoted in a uncritical manner. And I'm not saying that I oppose that, but I think we have not placed the same emphasis we have put on political aspects on economy. That's the point that I'm making.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and lady, for your thoughts on the first, second, third and fourth rounds. We're now going for a short commercial break. Is time running out on civil society to salvage the dream of realizing the January 2015 election promises? All this and more after a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. I start off the final round with Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, Senior Lecturer, The Open University. Dr. Amarasuriya, what I gathered so far from this conversation for the last 1.5 hours is the fact that there are dark clouds looming, and this is the sign of disaster. If we are to clear these dark clouds from the end of the tunnel, what must the civil society do? Your time starts now.
Okay, so Nirmal also spoke about some silver lining in the dark clouds, and that was the sort of increased democratized space and the sort of political engagement or the political consciousness that you see in people, and I think that's what we can build on. I mean, I don't think there are sort of uncomplicated, simple solutions that we can say that, you know, this is what we have to do and then there's a clear path to the next 18 months. It's a very complicated situation, and I think the responses are going to be equally complicated. So I think what's important is to keep that public engagement going, the political consciousness of people alive. And I mean, I see positive things also as a result of it. I mean, today's newspaper, I saw that Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been in Beruwala meeting with Muslim groups, right? I mean, why is he doing those things? Obviously, he is also having to respond to the pressure that he is facing from minority parties about what he was doing when he was in power, when he was the Secretary of Defense. So he has to respond. Whether he will keep to those promises, that's a separate thing, but at least he has to pretend to do so, right? And I think those are good things. I mean, no longer can politicians just come out and say anything they want and expect to get into power. They have to respond to certain concerns, and those are good. What we are better at is, I suppose, making sure they keep to what they have promised during the campaign period, and that, I think, is to do with the institutional failures and our sort of the culture of our political system, which sort of distances the elected politician from the constituency once they are in power, and then it's a different game that operates once they are in power as opposed to when they are out of power, and we seem to go through this cycle over and over again. But,
thank you very much, Dr. Harini Amarasuriya.
I would focus on the silver lining.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amarasuriya, for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I now move my attention to Dr. Uturn Fernando, researcher on civil society and NGOs. Dr. Fernando, should not the civil society be the backbone of the 2015 January 8th revolution to get back together on one path with one strategy and ensure that we forge ahead?
It's difficult because 2015 there were so many strands of civil society activism. So to unite, I mean, when it comes for an election, it's always possible to unite those forces. But once the election is over, it's hard because they have their other interests and so on. So I don't think that 2020 would be another point. So I think if you're thinking of broad-based civil society formations, I think we should think of bigger events. We can't think of intermittent small events. I don't think that it's possible because already some sections of civil society is dissolution, as some of my other panelists said. I agree with that, and some have been co-opted. So you see a kind of a reconfiguration of these forces as of now. But I'm also hopeful, but when there's another kind of a event and that kind of demands urgency and attention, these forces would coalesce with each other and would form a kind of a formidable force. So let's have hope on 2020.
So where do we stand currently as far as the good government is concerned?
I think we have, if we take the civil society MOU with the president and also with the government, in January and August respectively, there were three demands. One was the abolition of the presidential system. Second one was introducing a new constitution, and part of it was a durable solution to the ethnic conflict. So if you take these three demands, we can't see anything substantial being delivered by the government. So in that sense, it's a breach of contract, as Krishmal said, and the promise had not been kept by the government. So in that sense, things have come to square one.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Fernando, researcher on civil society and NGOs. I now move my attention to Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, Department of History, University of Colombo. Dr. Devasiri, do you think that the new government, the new coalition government, in the next 18 months will be able to face the challenges on the cost of living increases, demands of farmers, bad governance and non-delivery of promises, led public protests, joint opposition doosras, and even trade union unrest that is taking place right now? We see this from the GMOA on many fronts, on many occasions as well. Do you think that the newly elected or newly appointed cabinet will be able to face these doostras in the future?
Very unlikely. I don't think so. I mean, as Harini mentioned earlier, that they will be in the survival mode in the coming 18 months or so. So I think so I was listening to Minister Mangala Samaravira today. He was talking about the certain economic indicators, where he, promises that, there is there is a promising future in terms of, the economic performance. Well, I don't know. I'm not an economist, but from my understanding of the economic reality, the economic challenges that have been, that we are facing is not the issues that can be addressed through a very simple formula. So therefore, I would not think too much about the performance of the government. I'm thinking about the taking forward the political transformation that started in January 2015. From a different perspective, through the agency of the people, right? And what is important to see that there is a very live political dialogue happening in the country, and if you look at the social media and the non-traditional media, right? So it's a very live dialogue, right? So the people are expressing their views, and so therefore, if you are talking about the role of the civil society, or this kind of the intermediate groups, I would say, is to tap these new political developments rather than looking at the political parties and the elected members and so on. I think we need a serious political transformation. Our present political elite is not capable of delivering. So we need a kind of new, we need a new governing elite, right? But that is not definitely coming from the existing ones, right?
Thank you very much.
So therefore, yes, we have to continue with what we were doing. So that's.
Thank you very much.
No other
the struggle never stops, isn't it, no. Dr. Devasiri? So I now move attention our last speaker for sure. That is Krishmal Varasuri, lawyer, national convener, the Ratasiruki movement. Is time running out on civil society to salvage the dream of realizing the 2015 election pledges? Your time starts now.
The Declaration of Independence of the former US, and they broke off and the forefathers formulated, speaks, Shamir, among several other things, of the pursuit of happiness. I would like to ask your viewer, are you happy? Whether you're in the businesses, whether you're in the professions, whether you're in the labor force of the country, are you happy? And if you're not happy, your topic today, Shamir, becomes very relevant as to the role of civil society. You see, in this vicious cycle, as Nirmal said, we've realized that the professional politician, I'm talking of the politician that derives a living out of politics, one who earns a living out of politics, is not going to change this vicious cycle and educate the elector. Because if they educate the elector, they are not going to be able to buy their votes by a roofing sheet or a television set or a bicycle or 5,000 rupees before an election. That whether you call it Samurdhi, whether you call it Sevana, whether you call it now the new term Gam Peraliya, whatever Peraliya, they would like to keep that little sochang that they give the mass voter in their hand, give a fish rather than giving a fishing rod for them to make do of a living, for them to come out of the poverty, that they would like to, as much as possible, keep the elector at just below the poverty line if possible, so as long as they are subservient to them, the professional politician is going to be happy. So there is a role therefore for civil society to go out there and speak to the voter and the elector and educate them. What should you be voting for? What is the change that you want to see? If that is so, how do you organize yourselves? Whether in your village, whether in your corporate entity, in your trade, whether it's a fishing community, the carpentry community, you need to form associations. And we need civil society, therefore, certainly has not given up its battle in 2015. There is a much bigger battle ahead of us and we need to keep on fighting. Unfortunately, we in civil society also find it very difficult because even those of us are struggling to keep this manifesto going. So, I don't know, Shamir, if, as everyone agrees, the political system, the party system has failed, and whether, as Machiavelli says, out of the rubble will arise a new prince that none of us have seen yet in 2020, we don't know. It may be completely out of the political scenario, we don't know. It's up to the civil society there to go and educate the public, and up to the public to listen to what is being said.
Thank you very much, Krishman Varansurya, lawyer, national convener of the Ratasarakima movement. Thank you very much, Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri, for joining us this evening on the show. Dr. Uturn Fernando, it's always nice to have you on the show as well. Krishman Varansurya, the very vocal lawyer, the national convener of the Ratasarakima movement. And thank you very much, Dr. Harini Amarasuri, for joining us this evening on the show. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you very much, Nadeem, and thank you very much, Attorney at Law Sonali Vanigabadgi, for joining us this evening on the show. Krishman mentioned about the pursuit of happiness, so I thought I'll quote from the movie itself, The Pursuit of Happiness. If you got a dream, you got to protect it. People can't do something themselves. They want to tell you, you can't do it. If you want something, go and get it yourself. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This is Face the Nation. Next week, same time, same place. Until then, take care and have a wonderful week ahead.